If you feel like you're on a team where everyone doesn't have your back, is trying to get at your back to put a knife in it, you're not going to take any risks. You're not going to admit what's failing or where you need help. You're not going to give a real report on what's going on. You're going to try and cover your butt at all costs.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 245, Building Your Best Team Ever. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farson. Victor, here we are in what we will call the first real week of work in 2024. Can you believe we're starting yet another year?
I cannot believe that I'm working.
Well, are you sure you're working, or are you just playing video games again?
I cannot believe that I'm pretending to be working still.
Oh, that's the problem. That's it. Has your team started doing their annual goals already?
I don't know. I'm the only member of my team. So, okay, let me put it this way. Nobody from my team started working on annual goals. Not a single one of us.
So me, myself, and I haven't started working on any of the goals yet. Okay,
exactly.
I completely understand. On today's show, we have Dr. David Burkus on to talk about his latest book, Best Team Ever. David, how you doing?
I'm good. Life is good. New year. Goals are already set between me, myself, and I, and the rest of the team that actually does exist. So yeah, I'm good.
It's interesting that a lot of companies tend to believe that goal setting is a good thing. I'm not going to argue the point that it's a bad thing, but is it as good as most people think?
It's interesting. On an individual level, the research here is actually really interesting. And this is sort of a blindsided me with this question, but my mind goes right to the research. So here's what we know. In general, if you set goals and have them written down and hold yourself accountable to them, you're more likely to achieve what you wanted to in that year than if you just have this sort of vague notion. But there's two problems, right? Number one is if you share those goals too widely, which is counterintuitive. You would think that, announcing it all, other people will hold you accountable, but you're actually less likely to achieve the goals. And the theory here is that when you tell people like, this is the year I'm going to lose 20 pounds, or this is the year I'm going to get that promotion, et cetera, and people respond and go, hey, that's great. I'm really proud of you. You already got the dopamine hit a little bit. And so you already kind of feel accomplished. And so you don't actually pursue it, right? So here's what I do that I actually think works best is in December, I actually look back on my previous year, what clients did we serve, how many, volume, blah, blah, blah. We said all sorts of career and personal reflection. That then leads to what do I want to do in 2024? Then, and this is the key, what I do is I go, okay, what regular behaviors will bring me to that place? Right? What systems do I need to put in place? What habits do I need to adopt, et cetera? And then what I actually hold myself accountable to is not the goals. I usually don't look at the goals again until December. What I look at is, did I actually do that flexibility workout that I said I would do 3 times a week? Did I actually create content every single week? Whatever the goal is, did I actually do the system every single day? Did I keep the streak alive? And so my philosophy is that I call it the just keep showing up philosophy, right? If you just keep showing up to the behaviors that you're supposed to do, you have a much better chance of kind of hitting the goal. So not only are goals set, but habits are established, and the goal is to just keep those habits. And there are some things out of your control that you might not hit the goal. Like one of our goals for 2024 or for 2023 was to make the new book Best Team Ever a Wall Street Journal bestseller. Well, Wall Street Journal did away with their bestseller list. So that goal's not possible, but that's all right because I still have the sales numbers. I still have the other habits we're doing, right? So I tend to look at it that way. Goals are great to set as an aspiration, but pay much more attention to the behaviors on a regular basis that are going to get you there and hold yourself accountable to those.
When you say habits, I guess, so if I understood right, like as an example, you mentioned create content every week, right? So you're not setting the goal like, hey, create content that will reach this number of users or this number of reads or views or whatever, but it's more like generating muscle memory, right? I'm doing this every week.
Well, I can't, because I can't, part of it is I can't control that, right? I mean, I could say I want this many YouTube subscribers or this many views on it, but I don't actually control that. All I control is the creation of it. So that's what I hold myself accountable to. Now, I hope that if I do enough of it, it'll work out in the end. I hope that if I do enough marketing for Best Team Ever, we'll get the sales, and particularly sales in the week we wanted them to do something like a bestseller list. But again, it may end up having to be USA Today instead of Wall Street Journal or New York Times or whatever, right? Like, because I can't control the fact that they pause their list. Just like I can't control if the YouTube algorithm gods shine brightly on that video and show it to more people. Or really, I mean, I think I can control if my own existing fan base and audience and readers want that content. So that's a little bit inside of my control, but still, I might have ended up launching it at a bad time. I launched an entire book. This is a hard lesson learned. I launched an entire book called Under New Management on March 15th, 2016. Now, you might not remember what happened on that day, but I do. What happened on that day is that Donald Trump won Super Tuesday and basically became the inevitable nominee for the Republican Party presidential candidate. And zero media after the day my book launched were interested in talking to me about my book, right? Because that big ground shit, like, that happened. I can't control that. But what I could do is just continue to do those activities, make content, to continue to try and engage, reach out to podcasts, et cetera. Just keep trying to do the things I want to do and let the external factors be what they are.
I can imagine how that works. I feel that's how I operate. I think that's something that would work very well for me. And I think it does. But then I can see that could be also produce quite opposite effect for somebody who is not motivated, right? Okay, so I did this thing that I need to do for my company for this week. That's it. I'm done. I'm finished. Doesn't matter really what it is. Doesn't matter how useful that is and so on and so forth. I did a chore in a way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, now we get into a discussion about what exactly is motivation, intrinsic versus extrinsic, and what have you, right? Presumably, I would think that the people who are going to have that mentality are usually going to check the box on the activities they need to accomplish because they want that extrinsic reward, right? And okay, that works great. Ideally on your team, if you're in a management role, ideally you're trying to appeal to something deeper and more intrinsic on why they want to do those tasks, right? And not all tasks. Look, there are some parts of every job that are like terrible routine. I just have to get it done. I don't like doing it. But ideally as a leader, you're trying to find at least part of the job. The research suggests as little as 25% of the job, but you're trying to find tasks for every individual to do that they're intrinsically motivated to do, so that they either do them more, do them harder, do them more frequently, whatever it is. So now we get into a bigger discussion of motivation and how to manage all that. But for the sake of what we were talking about, I tend to think if we're having a collaborative conversation around goals, individual personal goals, and also team goals, this is something that's co-created from the beginning. And so if you're letting your team have some input on what those goals are, then I'm presuming they're going to be intrinsically motivated to act on the systems that it takes to bring those goals in, right? Big presumption, I know, but that's what I'm presuming.
And I was presuming I wasn't going to completely throw us off on a curveball, but yet here I was again. So we were talking about right there, co-creating the goals with the team. And that is sort of an underlying theme, not explicit, in the latest book, Best Teams Ever. Mm-hmm. And you had 3 main points in that book. And let me break out my notes. See, I have them written down, just to prove I actually at least read the Kindle version, if nothing else. Common understanding, that one I understand. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Then we have psychological safety. But wait, there's more. And then the third one is pro-social purpose. Okay, again, the first one, I got it. Not a big words. Long words, but not big. The next two, break those down for me, what those two really mean: psychological safety and pro-social purpose.
Yeah, happy to. So psychological safety refers to a climate on a team, an element inside the team's culture where people feel that it's safe for interpersonal risk taking, right? So that it's psychologically safe for interpersonal risk taking. Now, a big caveat here, because a lot of people hear this term and they think I'm talking about safe spaces and making sure people never feel sort of quote unquote unsafe. That's not actually what we're talking about. I mean, first of all, there's no such thing as safe spaces. There's only safe people, but that's a whole other monologue. What we mean here is not that you're never going to hear ideas you disagree with or that might threaten you. What we mean is that you feel free to share when you disagree with the norm. You feel safe enough to speak up because you disagree or share that new crazy idea or admit a failure, right? So those are all different examples of that kind of interpersonal risk taking. You feel like you can share a failure and what you learn from it and not be chastised for it or belittled for it. Doesn't mean you're not being held accountable for results, but just that you're not going to be attacked verbally or emotionally, et cetera, because you messed up somewhere, or that you're going to share a new idea and you're not going to be shut down immediately with that'll never work. Come on. You're not in that situation that a lot of people find themselves in where a leader says, think outside the box. And then when you do, they go, no, get back in the box. Right. So that's what we mean when we say psychological safety, that the team itself, not just your relationship with your boss or the team leader, but the whole team creates a climate where people feel like they can be themselves, express themselves, share their ideas, share their failures, and collectively learn from all of those different perspectives without any kind of personal conflict that might come from someone belittling someone else. So psychological safety. Pro-social purpose is actually, I added this word pro-social purpose. There's not a lot of people at this point, 2024, that disagree with the idea that purpose is important in work and in teams and what have you. But I think we have a weird take on this in that what often happens is leaders then go, great, let's hire a consultant and let's rewrite the mission statement. Don't get me wrong. If you want to hire me to help rewrite your mission statement, I'll take your money. But what works better is not to talk about a grandiose why we do what we do, but to actually talk about who we serve when we do a good job. Because not everyone in the company can connect immediately to the customers. Sometimes you have internal customers. Sometimes, you have customers, but you're really in it for the stakeholders. But every role exists in interdependence with each other. And so pro-social, meaning that it's focused on sort of that it's focused on other people, that when we talk about purpose, we're making the connection between why we do what we do and who's going to benefit from that. And it turns out that is not only more motivating on an individual level, but that also, let's say, motivates people to engage in more teamwork, more helping behaviors. The nerdy psychological term is organizational citizenship behaviors. But essentially, it encourages people to actually put their own egos aside and help their teammates much more often. So you get kind of a twofold benefit. You get the same motivation and inspiration as a generic purpose, maybe even more so, the research suggests. But you also get people who are better at being on a team because they see service as the element of why they're doing what they do.
Let's go back to common understanding.
Mm-hmm.
One of the stories you talk about is role clarity. And the way you talk about it is from a sudden food restaurant.
Oh, sudden service. Yeah,
Sudden
not fast
service.
food.
Not fast food,
Yeah.
sudden service. What does role clarity really mean? I mean, to me, what it means is I'm not being told exactly what to do. I have my boundary. I have my box. I can do anything within that box or within that lane I want to do, but I'm going in that direction. Is that a reasonable definition, or how far off am I on that?
I think it's a reasonable definition. I think certainly for what you do and for what the majority of your audience, I think it's a totally reasonable definition, right? But there are other jobs like in fast food or sudden service where how you do it is also what you're going to be held accountable for. But let's say for a knowledge work situation, a knowledge work team, knowing what's expected of you, right? And by when and what have you. And then the fact that you have freedom to do that as long as you deliver it, that's that kind of role clarity. I would add another element to that, which is that you also see how your work fits into the larger whole. And this is what I love about Pal's Sudden Service. So Pal's, if you have no idea, this is not a very large chain, although it's renowned in the fast food community, not only for its quality, meaning almost zero defects, one in every 3,600 orders, if I remember correctly, but also their profitability. They are even more so than Chick-fil-A. They are the most profitable per square footage of any fast food restaurant. And they do things a little weird when you first look at it. So number one is they're engaged in training because they want to provide people with role clarity. You will receive about 100 hours of training before you're kind of set loose to do what you want to do. And we're talking about burgers and fries here. What could you possibly, but 100 hours of training to make sure that you know what's expected of you. There are, depending on the restaurant, there's usually around 8 different roles in a restaurant between, frying, cooking the burgers, taking the orders, et cetera, et cetera. And you are going to be trained on multiple different roles. You may not even know what your job is for the night till you show up to work that day. And then based on who's there and how everybody would fit together, we create the team and divvy out those assigned roles. There's even checks to make sure that people are, after they've been trained, are aware of exactly what's expected of them performance-wise. They do these, they call them calibrations. Let's call them pop quizzes. Right? But essentially, you start your shift and you're given a pop quiz. How do you complete this task? Well, how do you assemble the perfect sauce burger is what they call them. How do you assemble this? What have you? And cheating is encouraged, by the way. This isn't just like, if you don't get it from memory, you're fired. This is, hey, you have until the end of your shift. If you don't know the answer, go talk to somebody else, but turn in this sheet that explains the instructions by the end of your shift so that we know you're reminded of all that. Now, I know what you're thinking. That seems dreadful, right? That seems like cog in the machine, no freedom, no autonomy, et cetera. But it turns out in that industry, PALS has remarkable tenure rates, especially for managers. PALS has remarkable engagement rates. Their food is high quality. Their profitability is off the charts because I think my theory is because not only are we being really specific on making sure you are trained and empowered to do the tasks you're supposed to do, but you also know you've been trained on every other role, so you know how it all fits together. You're not just doing the same job every single time. It's like, I think about like Henry Ford and the Model T factory where people are turning the exact same screw multiple times a minute, every single minute. No, you actually get to see the whole car. You actually get to see how the whole thing fits together. And now you better understand your role. And that just naturally kind of makes it more engaging. That holds you a bit more accountable, et cetera. So that's like role clarity plus compared to what we talk about usually in knowledge work. But it works really, really well, not only when you know what's expected of me and how to deliver on it, but you know how your work fits into that larger whole.
One of the other items in that common understanding was a phrase that you had, commander's intent. I guess the military term is where you were leaning there.
Yeah, it is a military term. So it generally refers to the idea that when you have an XO, commanding officer, and you have a specific mission, you have a specific, let's broaden it, use non-military terms, you have a specific project. One of the things you want to set out is this is what complete looks like. That commander's intent is this, that we capture or kill this person, or let's use a non-military, that done looks like that we have achieved this many number of clients while spending under this amount of money in budget. You have this is what done looks like. And the realization, the importance of commander's intent is that in military, the fog, what we call the fog of war is going to set in. But in any project, like you're going to run into unexpected things. This is actually, to circle back to our discussion at the top, this is why I don't pay too much attention to goals that are outside of my control. I can't control the environment, but I know what done looks like, right? So as a team, we have not only what's expected of me, but we have this is what done looks like. And as you were describing in your role and your sense of role clarity, what you end up with is I know what done looks like. Now, I may have to pivot. I may have to shift. We as a whole team may have to shift in order to achieve that because of things we didn't expect. But because we still know what that is, we can make those pivots a whole lot faster and we can still work a whole lot more effectively.
Let's move on to psychological safety. Give me the nickel definition of that again.
I would say the best definition, a climate of mutual trust and respect where team members feel that it's safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And then obviously there's a lot of different forms of interpersonal risk-taking.
Now, you had already mentioned Henry Ford, the Model T. Now, Ford, as a company, has done nothing but go up and to the right for the past 150 years, right?
I mean, overall for 150 years, but there's some very, very flat and even declining time periods in that there's a lot of zigs and zags in that.
What was one of the big zags? Not even a zig, like a zag meaning zero. If you will.
Yeah. So, well, not quite zero, literally $1 per share right? In 2006, Ford had been in a state of decline. All of the automotive companies had been in a state of decline, but in particular, Ford had been in a state of decline such that their share price, shares were trading for around $1, right? And that was when Bill Ford, the great grandson of Henry Ford, actually stepped down, truthfully, climate of at least vulnerability on his part to say, look, I know I'm the founder's great grandson, but I don't know how to solve this. And so actually stepped down, and the company hired Alan Mulally to take over as the CEO and help lead a turnaround. Now, Alan was already known for leading a turnaround at Boeing. He was the president of Boeing Commercial Air Products and was in that role during September 11th when every major commercial airline canceled all of their orders in like the same week. And okay, we got to figure out a way to stay profitable until we can shake all of this out, et cetera. Alan also designed what, in my opinion, is the greatest long-haul airplane. Alan was part of the team that designed, in my opinion, the greatest long-haul airplane. I travel a lot, and it's the 777, which is one of the more relaxing and enjoyable flights because of some engineering marvels on that plane. But anyway, so he was hired to take over at Ford, and one of the first things he noticed was how little psychological safety was going on throughout the whole company, but especially with the senior leadership team. The executive team is composed of about 16 people, and all of them at that level had gotten to that level by having a fiercely intra-competitive, I should say, mindset. Meaning they kind of looked at this corporate org chart, this corporate ladder, as something that if you had to step over someone to climb, that was okay. A lot of them felt like their competition was more in the room with them than in some other boardroom at some other company, right? And this is a huge problem, right? If you feel like you're on a team where everyone doesn't have your back, is trying to get at your back to put a knife in it, you're not going to take any risks. You're not going to admit what's failing or where you need help. You're not going to give a real report on what's going on. You're going to try and cover your butt at all costs. And that's exactly what was going on, right? You had this climate where people just felt like they couldn't share what was really the problem. And as a result, there were a bunch of problems. When Alan inherited in 2006 the CEO position, the existing forecast was that the company was going to lose $17 billion in 2006. And yet when he asked all of his executives for a status report in his first week in office, and he actually said, I want you to color code your status report to make this easy because there's a lot of you and there's a lot of different metrics. I want green to mean you're at plan. Yellow means you had to pivot, but you have a plan to get to your objectives. And red means you need help. You don't know exactly what's going on. Every single report, every slide was green. This company is going to lose $17 billion and all the slides are green, right? And this went on not just the first day. This wasn't like, no, hey, I was serious. I want to know what's wrong. It happened for 8 weeks. It took 8 weeks of people lying to each other because they didn't feel safe enough to express their vulnerabilities. And finally, in week 9, one executive, Mark Fields, who was in charge of the launch of the Ford Edge, shifted a little bit. And candidly, the reason he did wasn't that he, I finally believe what Alan's saying about psychological safety and trusting each other. He did it because he was backed into a corner. He was in charge of the launch of the Ford Edge, and there were production problems. There was a bottleneck, and they realized they're not going to get the cars to the dealers by the set launch date. They need to move the launch date back. And you get to a place where you can't deny that there's a problem, so he has to admit it. So he changes his slide to red. He reports out in week 9, hey, on the Edge launch, we're red. We don't know when we're going to be able to launch. We're working on the problem now. And if you think about everything that I just described and put yourself in that boardroom, right? Thunderbird conference room in Dearborn, Michigan. Here's the first person to be red. Everyone was silent. Everybody was just staring at Mark, right? I like to think of it as they're taking a good long look at Mark because it's the last they're ever going to see Mark. And then they're casually looking at Alan. How's Alan going to react? This is the first person who admitted a vulnerability. This guy's screwing up. How's Alan going to respond? And Alan actually told me at one point he felt like everybody was expecting him to push a button under the desk, right? And like 2 big burly guys in suits were going to come escort Mark out. But Alan actually started clapping. Alan just said, hey, Mark, that's great visibility. Okay, team, what can we do for Mark? How can we help? And so it was that idea that if you bring your problems to this team, you're not going to be chastised. You're going to be helped. That helped change the company, the culture and the tone in the executive boardroom and change the company as a whole. Now, one little side note I think is actually hilarious. The next week, week 10, everyone still showed up with green slides except Mark. because no one expected Mark to be in the room. Everyone thought Mark would have been fired before the next senior leadership team meeting. And when they finally showed up and they saw that Mark had actually gotten there early, Alan asked them to get there early, and they were sitting together at the boardroom table talking as everybody else filed in. Alan actually said that was the moment that changed Ford. When they saw that not only was Mark helped, Mark wasn't punished, right? This is something we need to fix. And Mark was visible about the problem, and therefore he's going to get the help he needs. And he's not fired. He's sitting at Alan's right hand. That moment, watching the other people see that, oh, Alan is serious. Alan says that moment was the moment that turned around Ford. And over the decade plus that he was the CEO of Ford, the share price started at $1. Gradually, it rose to $19 the year that he left, right? So a 19-fold increase. I kind of wish I could go back in time, like in Back to the Future 2, and like buy a bunch of Ford stock in 2006 if I knew where this was going, right? But that year, $19 a share, almost $7 billion profit, $6.6 billion profit. And the thing I think is actually kind of cool is when he showed all of that as a report to the board, he also said, I'm resigning, but I have a recommendation on who should succeed me as CEO. And he recommended Mark Fields, right? The first person that was willing to kind of be vulnerable, et cetera, right? Now, candidly, it's been over a decade since Mark was even the CEO, and they've had some zigs and zags again. And that just shows you that this is not a one and done thing. Building psychological safety, you don't just go to like a retreat, have everybody do trust falls, and suddenly you have psychological safety. It's a constant thing. We need to be constantly mindful of our behavior and our actions, the way we're talking to each other, the way we're willing to be vulnerable, because it's a constant cycle. And if you don't keep up with how people are treating each other, it'll devolve right back into that culture that it was. And I think Ford is a great example of that.
That reminds me a lot of the story of Nokia, except that there wasn't a happy ending at the end of the story, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, the reality is in a company that doesn't have psychological safety, the senior leadership team is usually the least informed about what's going on. Because if everyone at every level is afraid to tell their boss disappointing news, then everybody at every level is massaging it or hiding it. And as a result, when it flows up the hierarchy, it's not accurate anymore. And so unless you take active steps to build that psychological safety, you're not going to be able to make the best decisions because you're not getting the most accurate information.
I think one of the other stories that was in that section was about Frontier Communications. The part of that story that resonated sadly with me was the strong disconnect between the white collar and the blue collar workers, where the white collar workers is like, no, this is the way things really are. That should be your first warning.
Yeah, no, I agree. And sadly, in a lot of more industrial firms, you see that often. Any organization that has a really large headcount and a difference between home office and field, or home office and warehouse. Like I think about a TV show like The Office, where there was literally an office and then a warehouse. And there's so much sort of disconnect. And unfortunately, it tends to be the people with fancy degrees and all sorts of quantitative skills think they can manage by looking at the spreadsheet instead of walking around. And as a result, they just sort of tell people, no, you should be able to fix this problem in this amount of time. And Maggie Wilderotter, when she took over, after Frontier had actually tried to sell itself off, and the prospective buyer actually was like, no deal. Maggie was hired to turn it around and hopefully get it ready to sell or expand or what have you. And the first thing she did was ignore the white collar folks. The first thing she did was get out there and talk to people. I think it's funny too, because they were set up to do it. Frontier Communication owned a private jet, had pilots on staff. They could have left and gotten into the field anytime they wanted, and they didn't. And Maggie not only sold the private jet because, hey, we need to cut costs, then flew commercial to get out there and talk to as many people on the ground as what was going on, right? They wanted to get that accurate picture. And I think it's a huge example of, remember I said it's a climate of mutual trust and respect. What Alan needed to do was build trust among the senior leadership team. What Maggie needed to do was show that she respected the insights of all of those people in the field and got people actually listening to them in order to turn around Frontier.
So let's move on to pro-social purpose. And you gave a long explanation of that too, and I don't remember it anymore because it's been 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah, I'll give you the one sentence definition, that team members feel like they are making a meaningful contribution towards work that benefits others. I think of it as they put the who over the why, and we know who is served by the work that we're doing.
And one of the more interesting stories around that section was from Go figure, an accounting and auditing firm. How did that come into play?
Yeah, KPMG. Yeah, I mean, this is funny because actually in 2023, one of my best clients was not KPMG, but was an accounting and auditing firm. And here I am with all of these videos online and a book that says, look, accounting is boring, which I stand by. I do stand by my words on that. In particular, auditing is a thankless job, right? When you're a professional auditor, your job is essentially to grade other people's papers all day long, right? You're looking at the books, making sure it all matches. You're asking people questions about their work that they don't want to answer because they already feel threatened by your presence, right? I like to think of auditors kind of like the consultants in Office Space, Bob and Bob, where it's like, what do you do here, right? You're just constantly checking people's work, making them feel threatened. It's not fun. And so KPMG noted this. In 2004, Bruce Fowl, their kind of head of human resources, noted how low their engagement scores were and how any attempt to raise them in the traditional extrinsic things like perks and pay increases and more flexibility and all that sort of stuff had worked, but it had leveled off. And he zoomed in on one particular question in the engagement score, which is that I think the work that I do is important at KPMG. There were a lot of people who felt like, no, the work that I do is not actually important. I'm grading people's papers. It doesn't really matter. And so they engaged in kind of a twofold effort to reestablish this idea that their work was important because it enabled other people, that it served other people. The first was what they called the We Shape History campaign. Now, this is a campaign to show people who currently worked at KPMG how the history of the firm had involved prior employees in really notable events in world history. So they talked about how KPMG was tapped to manage a lot of the logistics and contracting in the Lend-Lease Act, which is how the Allies first entered World War II, not by directly fighting, but by lending and leasing equipment and aid and what have you. And KPMG managed the logistics of that. They talked about how in South Africa in 1992, KPMG was the firm that audited and certified the election of Nelson Mandela, first free election, first black president in South Africa. They also talked about how after 9/11, 2001, it was KPMG that helped manage a lot of the insurance contracts and recovery funds and things to help get that city up. And so at every one of these stories, they would make videos talking about it. They would make posters. And the idea was that if I asked you the question, what do you do at KPMG? You look at something like 1992 and you're like, well, we restore democracy, right? Or we help nations heal, because those are the things we're involved in. Now, it worked a little bit. It was exciting. It was a cool campaign. It probably won some marketing awards and that sort of thing. But it was actually what they did next that was even more motivating. Because if you think about what I just described, it's cool to know you're a part of a firm that has done great work in the past, but you're not doing that work. You're still auditing ConAgra or whatever, right? You're still doing that sort of boring, faceless work. And so after the We Shape History campaign, they turned their attention to what they called the 10,000 Stories Challenge. And they sent this challenge out to the 30,000 people inside the firm and said, you heard how we made a difference in the past. You tell us how you're making a difference right now. In other words, they asked all 30,000 employees, answer this question: who is served by the work you and your team is doing? And they even created an app where people could make posters that were similar to the posters they had made during the We Shape History campaign. So they feel like their work was kind of equivalent, at least visually, to that work. And the goal was 10,000 Stories Challenge because the goal was after a year, maybe they could get to 10,000 answers, right? 10,000 responses, 30,000 people. Well, after 6 months, they cut the whole thing short because they'd received 42,000 responses, which I get a kick out of. I was a business school professor for about a decade. And when I think about 42,000 out of a firm that only employs 30,000 people, I think, some people did the assignment twice. Some people went for extra credit, right? And if I think about accountants, yeah, those are the exact type of students that always did the extra credit even though they didn't need it, right? So all of this makes perfect sense to me. But what I think is really interesting is after all that was over, yeah, they got the increases in engagement and retention and all of that sort of thing. They got better performance out of their people because their people were motivated. But when they did their engagement, their immediate engagement survey after the 10,000 Stories Challenge was cut off and got 42,000 stories, they snuck a question in there. They asked every person, how well did your manager communicate purpose? And that allowed them to sort of separate the data and look at the differences in engagement between people whose manager or whose team had taken the assignment seriously and people who didn't. And essentially, people who didn't take the assignment seriously, their numbers were just as bad as they were before any of this started. It was only the teams that had a specific team-wide discussion about who we specifically serve, how when we do a good job, it benefits other people. They were responsible for all of the gains in engagement, all of the gains in productivity, et cetera. And so what I think about here is this is not about, and this is why I add this word pro-social, this is not about a CEO or a senior leadership team casting a vision and making this sort of propaganda, mission statement, vision statement, et cetera. This is about training every team leader at every level in the organization to have a conversation about why the work our team does is important, specifically who is served by us doing a great job at it. That's what moves the needle on things like engagement, motivation, team working behaviors. People seeing that specific connection between their job and someone who benefits from them doing their job.
Let's talk about one more story from that section.
Yeah.
I first saw this story. I was like, oh, this is going to be great. I'm all warm and fuzzy. We were going to talk about Legos, one of my favorite times of Lego with the Bionicles. And then you did a rug pull once I got to the end. And I was like, oh, come on. Tell us about that story.
So this is a great study that really provides kind of the in the lab research foundation to everything we just talked about, right? That people are more motivated when they experience meaning in their work, right? Or in contrast, when you demonstrate that someone's work is meaningless, they feel far more demotivated. So this is a study done, and I love, first of all, the late Gen X, early millennial in me absolutely loves that it was done with Lego Bionicles, because there was only like 4 years when those even existed in the market, right? And I remember them. But everybody remembers playing with Legos as a child and what have you. So what they did was essentially Lego Bionicles were like action figures you made out of Legos. So there was a set model you had to follow, et cetera. And they brought in the participants into the study and asked them to construct a Lego Bionicle. I'll pay you $2 if you construct this Lego Bionicle. And then at the end of it, they would tell people, look, we only have so many for the study, so we're going to have to break it down and use it later in the study. But you can enjoy building it, and we'll pay you $2. And then when they build the Bionicle, that's when people were randomized into one of two conditions. In one condition, the Bionicle was just moved underneath the table. A new box of parts was put out and said, hey, I'll tell you what, do you want to do it again? But this time I'll pay you $1.90. Right. And so it would go down by like 5% every time. I think I'm getting these numbers right. But if not, you can check them in Best Team Ever. And they would keep doing that. Okay, you finished it. We'll put it under the table. We'll ask you a new one. Now, in the other condition, as someone was building the second one, the research participant that had just paid them $2 would take the product they just paid $2 for and break it apart, tear it all up, and put it back into its box. In other words, right, you have one condition where everybody knows that this is part of a research experiment, but you have one condition where people are paid to do it and they get that sense of completion and they see their finished product and it goes under the table and they don't know what happens to it after that. And you have another where that work is literally torn down. The researchers actually called this the Sisyphic condition after Sisyphus, the person in Greek mythology pushes the rock up the hill, and when he gets to the top, it rolls back down. Because it was this idea that, we're paying you to do this, but it's totally meaningless. We're paying you to do this, and we're going to give you a visual reminder of how meaningful or how meaningless your work is. And then the real question was, how long do people persist? Well, it turned out that if in the let's call it purpose condition, where people see the finished product, and they know in the back of their mind that it's going to get taken apart, but they don't have to see that. They earned about $14. They completed, I forget how many, but it was maybe 11, let's say, Lego Bionicles. Now, in the other condition, they only persisted for like less than $10. And again, these are research studies done on college campuses. This is beer money, right? So this isn't, you think like, oh, you did that whole experiment for $14. Hey, that's actually not bad. I regularly was able to pay for an entire weekend of excursions as a college student on $14, right? So it's a decent amount of money if you think about a college student. But the point is that the ones in the Sisyphic condition, they gave up a whole lot sooner. They made a whole lot less money. Nothing else changed in the condition. You're building the exact same statues. The only difference is that I'm tearing it apart in front of you. I'm just reminding you that your work is meaningless. And I think this study is important for two reasons. Number one, if that's true, then the inverse is also true, that if I'm reminding you that your work has meaning, you'll persist in it longer, you'll work harder for it, et cetera. But also, you think about the work that we do, there are so many situations where we work really, really hard on something, and then the environment changes or the priorities change or something happens, and all of that work just doesn't matter anymore. And we just kind of say, hey, there's no time to talk about that previous project. Let's move on. I think as a leader, one of the important lessons here is that even if we didn't end up implementing that, you worked so hard to prepare that deck for this presentation and then the meeting got canceled, or you worked to work on this entire project and then we pivoted and we're not going to add that feature to the product at all. It's still worth taking the time to sit down with people and go, look what we learned from this. Look at the great work that we did, to show appreciation for the work that was done, even if it didn't end up in the final product, because otherwise all we're doing is tearing apart the Bionicle in front of people and not reminding them that their work actually does matter and makes a contribution, even if it didn't go in the final product because we learned this, or we'll still be able to use that, or what have you, right? So I think it shows in two different ways that talking about why the work that we do is important matters. And both, I think, are good lessons for managers.
Now, you also practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right?
Yeah. I was actually there earlier today. I can actually still kind of feel it in my knee. But yeah.
But the point of that is, I remember you talking about when you go to a competition, it's not win or lose, it's win or learn.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about, and by the way, you had a Freudian slip, I'm tearing this apart in front of you, you're doing such a great job, as it's being pointed, that was your Freudian slip there. Okay, whatever it is. But if we don't learn, that's a problem. But the other thing to think about too is, okay, this got thrown away. Can I mourn it? I don't need to go. I don't need to go into mourning for 6 weeks and hold on to it, but mourn it and move on.
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, I've trained, competed, now coached competitors in jiu-jitsu for a long, long time, and it's a nervous sport. I mean, it's MMA without the strikes. It's a wrestling. Someone is trying to hurt you, choke you unconscious, get your joint in an extended position that hurts such that you tap out, right? And so it's a nerve-wracking thing to go into competition. And so the line that we use often is that the purpose of competition, it's not to hurt people. It's that there are only two outcomes and both are positive. You'll either win, which means your techniques are great, you've refined it, you've conditioned yourself well, et cetera, or you'll learn, which means we'll figure out why you lost, we'll take it back to the gym, and we'll work on that so that it doesn't happen again. And in that way, you honestly learn a lot more when you do fail. You can grow a lot faster by getting beat. And I've seen research organizations do this. Like in the book, we actually talk about a biotech pharmaceutical company that actually runs drug wakes or failure funerals, if you will. This compound, we all worked on it for the last 6 months. We've done the initial trials, and we're not going to move it forward because it's just not promising. Let's still mourn it. Let's get together. This is a short meeting, 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes. Let's get together and let's talk about it. Let's talk about not only how much appreciation we have for working on it, like you said, to mourn it, but also what we learned from working on it. Maybe we learned a new technique that we can use in future trials, right? Maybe we just learned, it's like the Thomas Edison thing. We learned one more way it didn't work. We still did learn from that. And so not only do we mourn, but we also show appreciation for the lessons that grew for that. I honestly wish win or learn was a mentality we had in a whole lot more areas of our life than just a crazy esoteric sport like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Crazy and esoteric. Are you going to say that to somebody that actually practices that besides yourself?
Yeah, look, it is. I sometimes am. It's a weird, beautiful addiction that I sometimes am like, why couldn't I just take up running? Right? I totally get that it is not everyone's cup of tea, but it has some brilliant lessons for those of us who do adopt it.
I think in that case, you would be doing a lot more learning than you would be winning if you said that to somebody's face. Let's put it that way.
Love it.
So the book is Best Team Ever. David, where is the best place for people to connect with you?
Yeah, well, wherever they want. I'm really blessed in that David Burkus, Burkus, is a very esoteric name as well. So if you type that into Google, I'm the only one you're going to find. Actually, one of the pinnacles of my career was when Google stopped asking people, did you mean Nate Burkus, the designer from HGTV, right? So you'll find me. You'll find me on whatever social network you want to connect on, whether that's LinkedIn or Twitter, or we even have videos on TikTok these days, although don't message me on that because I never check it. So wherever you want to connect on that, please do, because this is not, I'm not naive. I don't think we're going to magically send out a 200-page book. People are going to read it, and then every organization is suddenly going to have an amazingly engaging culture. I'm buckled down for a long fight here. And if you want to join me on that, this is a conversation that'll keep going for a long time. So please do reach out, find out more about the book, but then reach out to me with any questions, and let's keep this conversation going.
So David can be found at davidburkus.com. Before we let you go, one last question. Mm-hmm. The last story in the book is about Victor's going to have no clue about this, about a baseball team called the Savannah Bananas, which questionably is still true or not in 2024. How did that land in the book?
Well, it started because I met this guy named Jesse Cole at a conference, and I said, "What do you do?" And he said, I own a college summer league team called the Savannah Bananas. And I was like, what? This was like 2016. They're an absolutely crazy story. It started out as what's called a Coastal Plain League. And the Coastal Plain League employs college players who are on summer break. They're not, I say employed, they're actually only allowed to play room and board, but it's a way for students to get additional training, to get additional experience playing games in front of audiences and what have you, to try and prepare for a run for majors or minors or what have you. And Jesse very quickly realized two things. Number one, people find baseball boring. And number two, Major League Baseball wasn't helping, right? In Major League Baseball, they nickel and dime you. Tickets are $100 now, and then you got to pay for parking. And then if you want a beer, it's $15 and what have you. And fewer and fewer kids were playing baseball. And so he wanted to change that around. And the way that he did was he decided to blend, like if you've ever seen him, and feel free to look him up on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram or what have you, because their games are more like going to a circus where a baseball game just happens to be played. Jesse's whole job is to entertain the fans. In fact, the company that owns the Bananas is called Fans First Entertainment LLC, right? It's that idea that everything we do is not about putting up great scores and home runs and what have you. It's about serving these fans and instilling a love of baseball in these people. Now, I think it's interesting for two reasons. Number one, at first, they were a college summer league team. And when a Georgia State professor, because they're in Savannah, decided to run the numbers, what he found was that athletes who come to play for the Bananas actually play better when they're playing for the Bananas than they do in college. And there's no trick to that. It's not like they use a different type of bat or what have you. It's just that they know who is served by the work they're doing. They have a stronger connection to their fans because they're trying to entertain their fans. They're making that connection, and that encourages them to sort of try harder, perform better. So they actually perform better than the way they play for their college team. The second thing is I actually have this line in the book, and this is the one part I think isn't true in this story. The opening line of that chapter is that they're the greatest baseball team you've never heard of. Well, that's quite simply not true these days. That fans first message and that methodology has grown like crazy. So the Bananas now travel the country. They play exhibition games, often against minor league teams, sometimes against a team that travels with them called the Party Animals. And they have an over 1 million person waiting list for tickets. They do about 30 different cities a year, 2 to 3 nights in each city. And it's just become this absolutely amazing phenomenon. And I think it stems from that idea. Revolutionary concept, right? That sports is actually about entertaining the fans and not about putting up great numbers or winning championships. But when you do that, you end up with players who play a whole lot better anyway.
So again, the book, Best Team Ever. David, thanks for being on with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.